thank you everybody for your patience and your support while we worked that out. It's great to see teamwork already, only 5 minutes into our webinar. So I will start again. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all here today to the first webinar in our series on building equity in Silicon Valley's food system. My name is Lucy Diekman, and I work with University of California Cooperative Extension on urban agriculture and food systems here in Santa Clara and San Mateo counties. And especially important for our purposes today, I am also a member of the South Bay Food Justice Collaborative, which is the group that is organizing and hosting this webinar series. So what you can expect today is sort of a broad interview to the topic and to the series. We'll introduce some core concepts, introduce you a little bit to this group, and then you'll hear from some really fascinating speakers about their work in different sectors of the food system. What I hope you'll take away from this entire series is that you'll come away with information, with strategies, but also with connections to other people in this virtual space that you can use in your work and in your communities to increase equity in our region's food systems. Next slide. And let's see, I think we've already covered this, so we can go to the next slide as well. And I know at this point, all of us have been on Zoom a lot in the last couple of years, but just a few quick reminders. First, please keep yourself muted unless there's a specific reason to speak, like being in small breakout groups, which we will do in a little bit. This is just a large group, and we want to try to minimize the disruptions. We will be using the chat for questions and comments. So if you have a question or you have something you'd like to share with the group, please add it to the chat. And then finally, if you do find that you need technical support at any point, our organizing team is here to help. And so please just directly message either Laura Vollmer or Angelina Gutierrez about any technical difficulties that come up, and they will do their best to troubleshoot those with you. Next slide. Thanks. So because we'll be talking about the food system throughout this webinar series, welcome, Javier. I wanted to make sure as we get started that we all have a common understanding of what a food system is. It's kind of an abstract concept that we may still hear a lot. The good news for all of you is that by virtue of being eaters, all of you are already part of the food system and are already really very knowledgeable about it. At the heart of what we think of as a food system are all of the activities, the people, the relationships, and the resources, things like land, refrigerated trucks, commercial kitchens, that help get food from farms to our plates. And now I would like to launch a poll, and the question for you to answer is how you engage in the food system on a regular basis. I know many of you here work in a role where you are supporting different parts of the food system, but for this poll, if it is launched or when it is launched, the question is really about you as an individual. So how do you personally engage with the food system on a regular basis, whether that's cooking or shopping or eating? Let me see, maybe I can. Fernando, is it possible to launch our poll? Okay, perfect. So thank you very much. While you take a moment or two to respond, I'll just mention some of the steps in this process. So those include growing and harvesting food, things like processing, packaging, transporting food. And if you're doing something with food that transforms it along with other ingredients into something else, like turning flour into bread or fruit into jam, that's all sort of considered this bucket of the food system as well. Then there's marketing, and that entails really all the places where you might encounter food. Maybe it's at a farmer's market, a grocery store, a restaurant, a food bank. Then there's the piece of preparing and eating food. And then finally, we have to manage our food waste. And ideally, if that's not being recovered, then it's being composted and it is then being returned as an input to farmers to help grow the next crop. Next slide, please. So let's see, if you Google food systems, you'll see a lot of different diagrams, but I wanted to include this one as well, because I think there's a couple of key components that the last picture we were looking at was missing. So the steps that bring food from farms to people are just one part of the food system. The other thing that I think is really important for all of us here to think about is this light green ring, so that the environment that the food system is part of, and this is meant to represent all of the things that influence our food system and all of the things that our food system interacts with. So the surrounding environment, the economy, what are the cultures and the communities of a place, like agricultural and food policy, agriculture and food education. All of these factors influence the food system as well. And as part of that enabling environment, there are support systems. And I think many of us here today are part of that support system. And so through our work, we do things that can help create better food systems in the particular place where we are located. And so individuals and entities in those support systems include government agencies, nonprofit organizations, funders, educators. And then the last piece to mention here is on the left, the small green wheel, and this represents the values that motivate people's work in the food system. And those are important because hopefully those values are shaping the outcomes that we're getting in our food system work. And often people get excited about food-related work because they see so much potential for changes in different ways that we relate to food or make food or eat food, as being able to have a really positive impact on our health, on our communities, on our economy, and on our environment. And so those are all some of the values that are represented there. Let's see, it looks like our poll results are in, and many of you have multiple roles there, but eating and cooking are our primary ones, but we also have a lot of gardeners and composters, which is great to see. Next slide, please. So next I wanted to introduce the South Bay Food Justice Collaborative, which is a group of organizations working across the food system, from sectors like urban agriculture to food security to healthy food retail. And as a group, we've been meeting since March 2020. I think we came together because we found that we had programs or projects or goals that were aligned, and we have appreciated having the opportunity to learn from each other, to learn about what others are doing, to identify opportunities and partners for collaboration, and then always to just sort of build the network of people who are interested in this type of work with the goal of advancing food justice in the South Bay. Next slide. I did also want to mention that this particular webinar series is motivated by one of the recommendations in the Santa Clara County Food System Work Plan, specifically to support food justice and food sovereignty through education about the root causes of inequities in the food system. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank our funders. Now, we got off to a little bit of a slow start, but I think we were planning to do a very quick stretch, just knowing that it's the end of the day and probably many of us have been sitting in front of a computer for a while. So I wanted to introduce my colleague, Joe C.V. Hultquist with the Santa Clara County Public Health Department to quickly take us through a stretch.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully, like me, it's about time to get up and move a little bit. So you can either choose to get up or just do it in your chair, but we're going to do a coconut stretch. We're going to actually spell the word coconut. So I want everybody to follow along with me. So like, you remember YMCA, like just visualize, we're going to do the same thing, but with coconut. So I want you to form a C. I want everybody to form a C stretch. Oh my gosh, that feels so good. Yes. Okay, and then I want you to do the big O. I'm going to back up so you can see me. Oh, and then the other side, we're going to do another C. Oh my God, I got to do this every day. I don't know about you. And then we're going back to an O. And then for the N, I want you to bend down, touch your toes. Bend down, touch your toes, everybody. Yes, that's so good on my back. Right, and then we're gonna come back up. Do a big U. You can even do a little more, get your shoulder blades going. And then a T. And you can even go back if you want to. Awesome. Fantastic. Great. Hopefully that made your shoulders feel a little bit better. Woo, feels so much better. Great. Now we're ready to be focused and pay attention to our wonderful speakers. I'm going to turn it back to you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I have to say, I always love being in meetings with nutrition and public health colleagues because you all have the greatest stretch breaks. Hopefully it's a thing that will catch on. It does feel good. Fernando, if you want to share the screen again, I wanted to talk next about some inequities in the food system. Thank you. And you can go to the next slide as well. Perfect. So having talked a little bit about the food system, I also just wanted to mention some common places in the food system where we see inequities. And I imagine that these are all or mostly familiar to many of you, but one of the prime areas where we think about inequity has to do with access to food and the affordability of food. And we see that expressed in higher rates of food insecurity, poor access to healthy foods, higher rates of chronic diet-related diseases among particularly people who are low income or people of color. Another area that I think is well known for being inequitable is labor within the food system. And that's because often, but not always, food and farm workers receive low pay, may work in challenging conditions, and have little access to benefits and opportunities for advancement. Production and distribution is another sector of the food system where there are a lot of inequities present, and you may have seen stuff in the news about land ownership, for instance, among Black farmers and the loss of land in the last 100 years. But this section is really about who has access to the land, to the resources and the support to create and sustain thriving farm and food businesses. And then we would be remiss not to mention power. Who has power within the food system to make decisions that help shape various outcomes? So our approach in this webinar is really to focus on looking at systems that cause injustices or inequities in the food system, and then trying to think about how we can make systems change. Next slide. So through this lens, we are trying to look broadly at the root causes of some of these structural issues. And in terms of the other webinars in the series, we'll really get into that in our second and our third webinar, where we'll look at some of the policies and the institutions that have shaped our farmland and our farming industry in the South Bay, as well as some of the policies and practices that have shaped housing and neighborhood development, and how all of that relates to people's ability to access food. Culture is another important piece of the systems that shape where we live and the types of opportunities that we have and the experiences that we have. And so in this webinar, we'll be looking at the ways in which various norms and customs validate some people's food preferences and experiences and traditions and invalidate others. Having looked through all of the registration information, I know that for the vast majority of you, learning how to apply all of this information in your work and make changes in the food system is really important. And so our last two events are really focused on strategies and solutions and ways to make change. And so we have a webinar in April, and then we'll meet in person in May to hopefully pull it all together. Next slide. So having talked about our approach to the webinar series, I just also wanted to talk about the goal. You know, why are we doing this? Why are we sort of trying to take this deep dive into the systems that produce some of these inequities in our food system? And that is because we all hope to see a food system that is more equitable. And so what that means is that everyone, regardless of your race, your class, your immigration status, and other social categories, has what you need or what they need to participate, prosper, and make decisions to reach their full potential. Next slide. And some of the components of this more equitable food system include improved access so that everyone has access to the resources that they need to grow, procure, and eat food that is affordable, healthy, and culturally relevant, that we have more participatory processes so that people can make decisions that shape the food system that they interact with on a daily basis. And then through all of these things together, that we start to see better outcomes in the food system and in our communities around health, around education, and economic opportunity. Next slide. All right, so we've had a chance to introduce a little bit of what we are about, but we did also want to give all of you the opportunity to introduce yourselves, at least to a subset of the people who are on the call today. So in a moment, Fernando is going to move you all into breakout rooms of about 3 or 4 people, where we ask that you will share your name, your affiliation, or what brought you here today, and then a favorite memory that has to do with food. And I think we'll be there for maybe 7 or so minutes, and then we'll all come back. But if you are ready, Fernando, I think we can open the breakout rooms.
I'm ready.
Yes, we have a little more time, although I think we may have just grabbed a few people who have come back ahead of schedule from there, or not ahead of schedule, but there's always that window when you're coming back from breakout rooms. So on the early side of the window. Welcome back. We hope you had a good conversation. While we wait, I'll mention also that you may need to rejoin your interpretation channel, having come back from the breakout room. I'm not sure if going in and coming back affects that at all, but if you don't mind taking a look and rejoining if necessary, that would be great.
Well, Fernanda just said it's time to come back.
All right, yes, it looks like people should be on their way back, although I think also the breakout room always gives you that window. So probably over the next minute or so, we'll see people coming back in. And for those of you who are returning from the breakout rooms, welcome back. I think we have probably 20 seconds or so more until everyone is back in the room. It may be that you need to rejoin your interpretation channel if you were in the breakout rooms and coming back into this main room. So while we get everybody in the room, if you don't mind checking to see if you need to rejoin, that would be great. And once we have everyone, we can do a formal check and make sure our interpretation is still running smoothly. And as we are waiting and getting started, if anybody has a takeaway from that conversation that you feel like sharing, please feel free to drop it in the chat. I know in our group it was fun to hear what everybody else's memories were, and it made me a little bit hungry because there were some great food stories that were shared. All right, I think we may all be back, so welcome everyone. We did have a request just to check that you are still in your interpretation channel. So please take a minute to look and see that you are either in English or Spanish, wherever you would like to be. So as we are coming back, we are going to move ahead and introduce our first speaker, and we'll be hearing from two people next. And our goal in this area is really to ground these sort of abstract, lofty concepts in the specifics of our region. So we're going to hear from two people locally who work in the food system, and they'll be sharing some of their experiences and knowledge with you. So that being said, it's my pleasure to introduce Solange Aguilar. Solange works with Vegilution as both a community hub coordinator and a promotora. And I think she'll have some really interesting stories and experiences to share with you from her time working in the East Side San Jose community. Solange, whenever you're ready, you are welcome to begin speaking.
Thank you, Lucy. Parece que el canal de interpretación no está funcionando bien. Pero ya nos escuchó.
Let me fix that. 1 second.
Thank you.
Thanks, Fernando, and thanks again, everyone, for your patience as we navigate the interpretation.
En español.
Entonces las personas tienen que cambiar al inglés. Tienes que hacer el anuncio, por favor. No sé si nos escuchan.
Sí, right now we are all in the same room. Ahora estamos todos en el mismo salón. So now the presentation is going to be in Spanish. So to hear those who speak English, you need to select your language. Let me open this up. This system. All right. So if you speak English, please look in your interpretation button in the screen and choose your language. Y los que hablamos español, por favor, quédense aquí en el room, no tienen que elegir porque van a escuchar directamente de Solange.
Muy bien, gracias, Fernando. Hola a todos, buenas tardes. Yo soy Solange Aguilar y actualmente estoy trabajando para Vegilution como promotora y como coordinadora del centro comunitario. Y bueno, mi experiencia sobre la justicia alimentaria ha sido muy amplia, ya que estoy trabajando directamente con la comunidad y constantemente estoy escuchando historias de lo difícil que ha sido tener acceso a la comida saludable. Muchas personas necesitan ayuda para completar su despensa, por lo cual acuden a bancos de alimentos y bueno, muchos de ellos me comentan que desafortunadamente no es lo que esperan. Sin embargo, muchos siguen ahí recibiendo esta comida, aunque no es lo que desean comer, porque no tienen opción. Algunas otras personas o familias sí desean, dejan de ir por esta comida porque lo consideran que no es saludable. Constantemente me están expresando y nos dicen que la comida es enlatada, o sea, enfrascada y a veces hasta a punto de caducar o caducada, y las frutas y vegetales que les proveen están a punto de echarse a perder, por lo cual es una cantidad un poco grande y no les alcanza, más bien es demasiado para consumir entre 1 o 2 días antes de que se descomponga por completa. Y pues bueno, este tipo de historias los estamos escuchando constantemente, las promotoras y yo, cuando hacemos alcance en la comunidad, que estamos yendo como 3 veces a la semana, y esto lo escuchamos cada día de diferentes familias. Y muchas de estas personas expresan también su deseo de comer saludable, puesto que vienen muchos de países donde la comida envasada, enlatada y llena de conservantes no es la mejor opción. Pero sin embargo, al llegar acá, pues tienen que acostumbrarse a eso. Y ahora, pues, porque ha subido bastante la comida, les es muy difícil agarrar la comida que ellos desean comer, que consideran que es saludable. Especialmente en esta temporada, en este tiempo de inflación, donde los precios de la comida han sido elevados el doble o incluso hasta más del doble. Y bueno, ellos sienten un poco de frustración de no poder consumir lo que ellos desean. Y bueno, desde mi punto de vista, esto me parece muy injusto porque deberíamos de tener comida saludable para todos para poder evitar las enfermedades crónicas. Y algo que me hizo pensar es que, por un lado, los departamentos de salud, tanto como los doctores, los médicos constantemente nos están diciendo que consumamos más comida saludable, que agreguemos más frutas y verduras a nuestras dietas y que dejemos la comida chatarra, la comida llena de conservadores, los jugos envasados, etcétera. Pero por otro lado, me doy cuenta que hay un desbalance en el sistema, porque la comida rápida y chatarra es más económica, lo cual es más fácil el acceso para las familias. A la vez satisface más rápido el apetito de los niños y de todas las personas. Sin embargo, no se está nutriendo su cuerpo. Algo que me impactó recientemente es el testimonio de 3 familias diferentes en un periodo de 2 semanas, en situaciones diferentes, en diferentes lugares, y pues me contaron la misma historia básicamente. Ellas me decían que han dejado de llevar los niños con ellas cuando van a surtir el supermercado. Y la razón es que porque los niños les están pidiendo más comida, y algo que es impactante, que realmente me llamó la atención, es que no necesariamente los niños les están pidiendo comida chatarra, les están pidiendo frutas. Y es triste darnos cuenta que un padre de familia no pueda comprarle más frutas y verduras a los niños, o sea, que ellos lo desean y no poder hacerlo, es realmente frustrante. Entonces, pues, no sé, como promotora es un poco difícil estar escuchando estas historias de parte de diferentes familias constantemente. Y vaya, otra cosa que, aparte de ser promotora y coordinadora, yo soy calificada como coach en cambio de hábitos y nutrición. Y pues muchas de las veces, cuando las familias me permiten, yo les puedo dar consejos de lo que pueden hacer o pueden cambiar. Sin embargo, esto sigue siendo un poco triste y frustrante para mí, que los niños más pequeños que piden frutas y verduras no lo pueden obtener porque sus padres no los pueden comprar. Otra cosa que quería comentarles, que en Vegilution existe un programa de entrega de cajas de verduras para la comunidad de bajos ingresos. Muchas familias que antes recibían estas cajas se han quedado sin esta ayuda, porque los cambios de proveedores y los nuevos fondos originarios del gobierno nacional con el America Rescue Plan Act, con sus siglas en inglés, el ARPA, tiene muchos requisitos. Los requisitos actuales son que las familias no pueden recibir ninguna otra ayuda alimentaria del gobierno federal y tienen que vivir en ciertos vecindarios de bajos ingresos. Estos requisitos mucha gente los considera realmente absurdos porque no reciben suficiente ayuda federal como para no poder recibir una caja, es lo que ellos expresan y dicen comúnmente. Un ejemplo que nos han dado es el WIC. Muchas personas reciben WIC, pero el WIC está enfocado para un niño menor de 5 años, una madre que está embarazada o una madre que está lactando. Sin embargo, hay más miembros en esa familia y no se está tomando en cuenta a esos niños, y por esta razón es que los fondos para estas cajas ya no pueden ir a esas familias. Y este es el caso de muchas familias que se quedaron sin poder recibir su caja. Ellas platican con nosotros, nos dan sus testimonios, y quiero leerles uno de los testimonios que me dio una madre a mí directamente, y se los voy a leer. Dice: antes podía añadir los vegetales a todas las comidas y los niños comenzaron a comer más vegetales cada día gracias a la caja que recibía. Y ahora no siempre puedo comprar todo lo que contenía la caja. A veces compro, a veces no. A veces solo compro con lo poco que me dan del WIC, pero eso solo es para la niña más pequeña. O sea que desafortunadamente desde que ya no reciben esta caja, los niños han dejado de poder consumir, toda la familia en sí han dejado de poder consumir estos vegetales que son tanto orgánicos, frescos y súper saludables. Por otro lado, otra señora mayor me contó: gracias a la caja que me daban, conocí más vegetales que antes no sabía que existían. Aprendí a cocinarlos y ahora me quedé acostumbrada, pero no puedo comprarlos en la tienda porque son costosos. No sabía lo valiosa que era esta caja para mí hasta que ya no pude recibirla por los requisitos que han puesto. Y bueno, esto me hace pensar que realmente la caja ayuda de varias maneras. No es solo una simple caja de verduras, sino que su valor es mucho más grande de lo que realmente le cuesta a un proveedor monetariamente. Y bueno, historias como estas constantemente estamos escuchando junto con las promotoras. La comunidad ha pensado que si tuviéramos más mercados agrícolas con gran variedad de frutas y verduras y que fueran a bajo costo o un costo razonable, eso sería de mucha ayuda y ellos podrían tener más acceso a la comida pues más saludable, fresca, y un poco sería más fácil para ellos. Y bueno, muchas gracias. Pregunta.
Muchas gracias. Go ahead, Lucy.
No, I was going to say the same thing, Fernando. Thank you very much, Solange. That was really interesting. I think we probably have time for one question. So if anybody has a question that they'd like to ask, please feel free to drop that in the chat now. Yes, and thank you for sharing those stories, Solange. I think it was a really powerful example, not only of sort of the solutions that you see people proposing and the hopes that people have that you're working with, but also the ways in which costs can be a challenge and also policies can be a challenge. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of thank yous, Solange, but not a lot of questions. So maybe with that in mind, we should start our transition to our next speaker, who is Javier Zamora. And Javier is the farmer behind JSM Organic Farms, which is located in Aromas, California. And Javier, I think, is a strong advocate for small farmers and knows really well both what motivates them, but also some of the challenges they encounter. So Javier, we're really looking forward to hearing more about our food system from your perspective.
Oh,
And
absolutely. Thank you.
before Javier, this is Fernando. Javier, you're gonna speak in English?
I will probably do it in English.
All
I
right.
think you guys do a really good job translating to Spanish. I won't, I'll stop once in a while so you guys can catch up. But I understand.
Uh-huh.
I would definitely feel I can go both ways, but this time I would rather do it in English, so it's a lot easier for you to translate. How about that?
That sounds good. So, para los que nos escuchan en español, please por favor, elige tu lenguaje. Right now, we're going to translate from English to Spanish. So if Spanish is your language, please select your language. Thank you, Javier. We are ready.
All right, you're very welcome. Thank you for translating and interpreting for those that unfortunately, they need a little more time to get used to the language in America. But I want you to know that my farm is open for you to come in at any time, and I will show you what I do, and you will get to take home some really delicious veggies and strawberries and other fruits. Maybe not right now because it's flooded, but in about 2 months you can do that and enjoy some of the stuff that we grow. Thank you again. My name is Javier Zamora, and I'm a certified organic grower out of Aromas between Watsonville and Salinas. And I'm really happy to be here because a lot of times you don't get to hear from an actual farmer. I grow mainly strawberries, raspberries, blackberries, some blueberries, and lots of veggies and lots of flowers, all certified organic. And my vegetables and fruits get sold locally, like in San Jose at like a New Leaf Community Market, so Four Seasons, some of the city stores like Buy Right Markets and Rainbow, and a little bit of farmers markets like the Fort Mason. Or we also sell in Oakland at the Fruit Bell BART station, and during the season, during the summertime, I go to Escuela Popular myself or with my daughter or with one of my team members to make the veggies available to some of our community members that otherwise don't get an opportunity to enjoy it. On my way here, I just came back from the farm. I needed to come home so I get better reception, but I pull out a few carrots. They're delicious. 45 minutes, it was in the ground. I think a lot of the issues that we face in this community is the access to food, not necessarily because in this case, organic food is very expensive. I think what happens is as time goes by, the amount of farmers that are independent or farms that are independently owned are not necessarily growing, they're actually disappearing. So what you are seeing lately, it's very few players in our food system that are kind of like buying out other farms. As growers, we get older and older. We don't really have the new kids that are interested in growing our food, which is really, really scary. So certain things that we need to do as community members, I think you should know that you eaters in the city are the most powerful individuals to make a change. And the reason for that is because you need to know where your food's coming from and who's growing your food. So you have the dollars, you spend the money. If you don't ask and if you don't educate yourself, chances are you might be eating vegetables that are coming from far, far away. China, Chile, or a lot from Mexico. There's nothing wrong with that. But we have to make sure that the food that it's grown locally gets eaten locally or regionally, and the farmers that are in our area, you're only 45 minutes away from me. And the thousands of strawberries that I grow will probably should not go any farther than San Jose, Monterey, or the city of San Francisco. Why did I need to go and sell my strawberries to Oregon when I could sell them all here? The reason for that is because the main companies saturate the markets and doesn't allow the small farmer to succeed, unfortunately. But in my case, I can tell you that I started with a little farm an acre and a half to 10 years ago. I farm over 100 acres. I'm one of those individuals that I am very blessed that I actually own my land. I have a mortgage on a farm now. And it's been very challenging, but I figure out the way of how to figure out the resources that would allow me to grow from 1.5 acres to 3.5 acres to 6 acres to 20 acres to 50 acres to 100 acres. And hiring just my 2 kids, my wife, and then 2 people, 3 people, 20 people. Last year, we ended up with 48 people. And I can guarantee you that we're feeding over 100,000 people with what we grow. So, but to me, the success that I've had is because I'm really open about having the customer come in and see what we're doing. And being an independently owned farm allows me to do that. The main biggest farms, they don't want you to come in because of a lawsuit, because of whatever it is. I want to make sure that I'm not saying that I'm against big farms. We need the big farms because there's just a lot of humans that need to be fed. But something that I want you to understand is that I want to teach you how to farm. I want you to see how to grow things. And I want to make it a little more attractive to new generations to farm. Because if we don't get any new members of our community, the youngsters, chances are your great-grandkids will likely not have the choices that we do right now. So there's a lot to think about and there's a lot to talk. And I don't want to be the only guy, giving you the issues that we face. But what I can tell you is that get involved. You are the most powerful individual to make the change. In this world that is driven by economics, your dollar bills are worth a lot and can make a big change. You could, if you want to see what we do, you can see our website. You can follow us on Instagram, JSM Organics. And please send us an email and say, Javier, I'm going to go to Monterey or Santa Cruz, and I want to stop by your farm. Just give us a little heads up, a day or two, so we make sure that somebody will be around to show you the farm, and you can get to pick your own strawberries and enjoy them. You can get to see what we do. And then you'll feel a lot better. You'll appreciate it more. And then you are going to be asking, where are these things coming from? And a lot of the things that the last speaker had, that a lot of the issues that she mentioned is because I think
Now you're back,
am I there?
Javier. Yes.
Okay, sorry. I was just, somebody was calling me. I don't have any other, there's no landline where I live. It's just
No problem, no
cellular.
problem.
So many of the issues that people not having access to food is because the beautiful stores where organic food is sold have made you believe that it's more expensive. Yes, it is a little more challenging for us, and it should be worth more because we don't use any pesticides. It's all done by hand. But the earnings that the large companies get by utilizing the organic label makes it a lot more difficult for those companies that have, for those individuals that don't have higher wages to have access to it. But it shouldn't be that way. If there is somebody out there that wants to donate 150 laptops to underserved kids, why don't you donate some money to a farm that can grow 700 boxes during the season for those individuals, I guarantee you, you'll have and you'll make a greater impact if you do that, because you are going to be supporting their health and you're going to make the family be part of a group instead of separating them from the family, looking at their tablets or iPhones or whatever it is. There's nothing wrong with that. But I think there's different ways of collaborating with our communities that can be better and can alleviate some of these health issues that we face and some of these issues that we're definitely see every day. Families not having access to healthy food or farms that are growing local food for them that can definitely make a big change. And I'll be more than happy to teach you what I know or get somebody started. But I think we can start by having you come and see what we do and getting to enjoy some delicious strawberries.
Thank you so much, Javier. I think from the chat, it looks like you have a number of people who want to take you up on the offer to come and visit the farm. We are a little pressed for time, so I think we will keep going on to our next speaker. But again, both Javier and Solange, we thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to talk with us today and for the inspiring work that you do. Javier, I don't know if you have access to the chat. There is one question in there for you if you have the opportunity to try to respond. But in the meantime, I want to invite or to introduce and then invite to speak our final speaker. Dr. Ann Lopez is the Executive Director of the Center for Farm Worker Families. And she's going to be talking specifically about farm workers and the California agricultural industry. I think some of those less independent farms that Javier was mentioning. So Dr. Lopez, I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much.
And I'm going to stop sharing my screen to move to another slide. And Dr. Ann, you need to unmute yourself. You still are muted.
Yeah, I'm unmuted.
Nice. So give me 1 second.
Sure.
All right.
There you are. So the work that I do is more on a global scale. It's on a larger scale. And I love hearing about the individual farms, and that's certainly important, and we need to work regionally, but ultimately I think we need a global movement to transform the industrial agricultural system. And next slide. The work that I did was in West Central Mexico when I was working on my PhD. This is the family of Justin Avila, and this family lived in Jalisco, in Los Sauces de Perez in Jalisco. And next slide. They and let's see, it's a little big, but they and almost everybody in the West Central Mexico countryside that I visited survived by growing the corn, bean, and squash intercrop. There's been much scientific research done on the relationships of these crops to each other. And it's the general consensus is that pests are really not a problem when you grow these three together. They basically maintain themselves. And we think that this ancient cropping system is probably 7,000 to 9,000 years old. Next slide. And in the 90s, the global neoliberal economy came into effect. And prior to this period of time, Mexico protected its subsistence and small producer farmers by instituting tariffs at the border. So anybody who wanted to bring corn into Mexico to compete with these subsistence farmers would have to pay a heavy tariff at the border. And most people or most organizations, companies didn't think that they could make a profit in this way. But then with the global neoliberal economy, things changed drastically. The whole economic system became global, and for the global transport of goods, comparative advantage, where can you get things cheapest, where can you have them shipped in? And the 4 pillars that I'm particularly concerned about are, number one, to privatize everything. So rather than having state parks, national parks, whatever, for the public good, you privatize them, sell them to a wealthy individual so they can make profits. You deregulate everything. And oh my goodness, we have a system with this neoliberal economy where basically anybody can create anything and throw it out into the world, and we have to deal with it. And currently, as an example, 80%, according to the CDC, of people in this country have glyphosate. This is Roundup herbicide in their urine. So this herbicide is in the bodies of 80% of the population. This is deregulation. We have, if you saw the movie Dark Waters, the PFAS, forever chemicals, that DuPont puts out. Again, throw them in the environment, and now almost everybody has PFAS in their body. Microplastics, all these things that have been deregulated. And the whole purpose of this is to make profits in the short term, even at tremendous human and environmental costs. And then the third one, eliminate public services. So the whole goal, for instance, of the charter systems of schools is to transition away from public education into private education so that people have to pay for their education. Public education is not considered part of the public good anymore. We used to have in Santa Cruz county hospitals, anybody could go in and get served. Those are gone. And finally, when all else fails, if somebody cannot make it in this neoliberal economy, then you blame them. And we certainly see that with examples from the homeless populations, where rather than address the issue and come up with concrete solutions to resolve the problems, whether it's mental health or loss of income or whatever it is, you blame the poor. That becomes a convenient scapegoat. And certainly farm workers fit into that category. So beyond that, the neoliberal economy is largely dependent on exploited labor. And farm workers are, to me, some of the most exploited workers. Next slide. And so NAFTA is the quintessential trade agreement, although it supposedly has been modified. But the whole goal of the North American Free Trade Agreement was to get rid of those tariffs at the border so that we as a country, because we had corn superiority, could dump all of our corn into Mexico, undercut the price that these small producer farmers had always gotten, and become dominant in terms of corn worldwide. So the goal of NAFTA was to get rid of those tariffs. And it took some time, but the goal was to eliminate the tariffs over a 15-year period. In fact, they were gone in 30 months. And our cheap corn, most of which is genetically modified, began being dumped into Mexico almost immediately, thus contaminating these hand-selected strains of maíz criollo, or this kind of ancient corn in Mexico. And the contamination continues today, although in 2013, a federal judge ruled in Mexico that Mexico could no longer sell corn from the United States. However, it continues regardless. So what happens then is now the Mexican farmers lose their livelihood. They have a choice of staying on their farms and starving with their family. And I actually interviewed 2 or 3 families that had made that choice. It was very sad. Another choice was to go to a large city like Mexico City and try to find work and then send money home to the family on the farm. If you go to Mexico City today and go up in a plane, it is literally ringed with shanty towns of these displaced workers. And then lastly, many farmers or or their relatives decided to go to the United States and to take up work in California's corporate agribusiness. Next slide. And I argue that farm workers that work in California's corporate agribusiness constitute a subclass of near slaves that live within a framework of institutions, laws, regulations, and policies that maintain their oppression and from which escape is nearly impossible. And of course, it starts with the fact that when they arrive, they're undocumented. And I personally don't think that anybody who works in the fields for weeks, months, and years should be undocumented and worried about deportation and having their families split apart. I just think it's completely unethical, but it certainly gives the growers a very easily controlled population to pick the crops and promote them in that sense. Next slide. And this is another picture of corporate agribusiness. Next. So farm workers are subjected to what's called agricultural exceptionalism. I had a reporter call me today and ask about the 7 farm workers that were killed in Half Moon Bay. And she said, when I talked to the farm workers, they said that there really was no minimum wage. And that's correct. For farm workers, there is no minimum wage. Farm workers are not protected under the National Labor Relations laws. They're exempt from many of the protections under the Fair Labor Standards Act. They're exempt from most minimum wages. And not only that, it gets worse than that. The grower can pay them whatever they want. And 22% of farm workers then have their wages stolen. So they don't even get paid. The wages are stolen. This came out in a recent research from UC Merced. 500,000 children currently work in the field, and there's very few labor protections for these children. And there's just generally a lack of transparency in the food system. Next. They experience substandard housing. Next. And often unsafe transportation. They're excluded from unemployment insurance. They're prevented from collective bargaining. There are many forced labor abuses of all kinds. One recent, or actually 2 recently, that I experienced. One, a woman called me hysterical about, I'd say 3 weeks ago. and she was crying uncontrollably, saying that she had just been sexually assaulted in the field. And according to UC Davis and the Southern Poverty Law Center, 60 to 80% of women farm workers are sexually harassed, groped, or outright raped in the field. So there's no oversight. Another example is forced labor abuse. Is during the heat wave that we had, there were farm workers in fields in a farm, and the temperature got to be between 100 and 108, and they started fainting, and they begged their supervisor to let them go, and they wouldn't do it. One woman fell and hit her head and had to be taken to the hospital in an ambulance. There's lack of workers' compensation protection, and there's all kinds of loopholes for occupational safety and other standards. Basically, any kind of constraints that are used to protect farm workers while they're at work, there's some way of undermining them. Next. I mentioned heat stress. Pesticide exposure is just, I mean, that's a whole topic that we're now at war with the Department of Pesticide Regulation about. Farm workers call me and tell me that they're spraying pesticides right near where they're working. People are vomiting, fainting, nauseous, etc. And I call the agricultural commissioner, who then sends out a team to find out what's going on. Unfortunately, as undocumented workers, the farm workers don't talk because they feel that they're at risk of deportation and also at risk of being blacklisted for employment throughout the state. Next. And there's 4 things that farm workers need. One, they need the knowledge that their work is valued. And right now, most of them just feel like they're slave labor, and that the general public doesn't see much value in their work. I think that's changing, but that's the general attitude. We need comprehensive immigration reform. How long does this workforce have to be tortured with constant fear of deportation and having their families torn apart when they're providing such essential service? I mean, none of us would eat. I always think to myself, if the Silicon Valley executive making six-digit figure salaries, if the farm workers weren't there, they wouldn't be eating. They're really the bottom line when it comes to maintaining a society, and yet they're treated so horrifically. They need a living wage. They should not have to depend on charity to survive. They ought to be paid a just wage for the essential work that they do, so they can buy their own food with dignity, buy their own clothes, whatever their kids need, etc. And finally, we need a contract to protect them from wage theft, which is, like I said, 22% of the wages are stolen. Next. So, given all this information, if we look at the players, we can come to some conclusions. If we look at 4 players in the industrial food production system, we have farm workers, growers, consumers, and then the environment, of course. Farm workers with few, if any, rights, a life of perpetual poverty, a life expectancy of an average of only 49 years, no health insurance, inadequate nutrition, and often deplorable, crowded, substandard housing conditions are relegated to the dehumanized status of a discardable, impoverished slave labor force that results from the neoliberal agribusiness system of food production. If we look at growers certainly have it a lot better than the farm workers. Many of them, at least in the Watsonville area where I work, have become millionaires in the process, especially those like Driscoll Associates that have vertically integrated corporations. However, in the neoliberal economy, they're not only competing with other growers in the area, they're also competing internationally. So if you can grow strawberries cheaper in Taiwan and send them to Watsonville, they can undermine the strawberries the Watsonville growers are growing and put them out of business. Or the Watsonville growers can continue to lower the wages of the farm workers and in what is often called the race to the bottom. In terms of consumers like you and me, we unwittingly purchase the produce of a slave class of people that live in nearly perpetual physical and emotional pain, thus supporting a corporate agribusiness system that systematically exploits both labor and the environment. Since the heavy use of pesticides in conventional ag leaves residues behind in food, consumers do not know what poisons they are consuming and how they will affect their health. They are even kept in the dark regarding whether or not the food product contains transgenic grains or other products, even in the face of mounting scientific evidence demonstrating that transgenics are harmful both to human health and the environment. And on that note, I should mention that if you go to a Staff of Life store or New Leaf store or whatever to purchase food, there's a big emphasis on organic, non-GMO, but there's no discussion about how that food was produced, what the farm workers that produced it experienced. The labor conditions are just thrown under the carpet. And finally, with the environment, with literally millions of pounds of pesticides infusing the environment every year, we are losing species and even the bees that are critical to successful pollination. According to the World Wildlife Fund, since 1970, we have lost 2/3 of all wild animals on this planet. Not only that, 1/10 of all the world's wilderness has been lost in the last 20 years, and South America has lost 30% of its wilderness area, and Africa lost about 14%. This is an entirely unsustainable system. So perhaps if there is a winner in this scenario, it's the agrochemical biotech companies that reap enormous profits from marketing their poisonous wares. However, these poisons will impact the quality of life for all the children born today, even the children of those who promote agrochemical use and GMOs in the world today. So their children will eventually pay the price. So I have 3 reports that I think are very important, one from the UN, one from the Rodale Institute, that indicate that if we stop this nonsense overnight and transform the food system to organic regenerative, we could feed everybody on the planet and we could sustain the environment for future generations. So the question needs to be, why aren't we doing that? And right now, the institutions that we have that are supposedly protecting us are not doing that. There, again, a lack of transparency. A good example is the Department of Pesticide Regulation that's supposed to regulate the pesticides that are used. But the interesting thing is that their funding comes from the agrochemical companies themselves. So the incentive is to get farmers to use more and more pesticides so that the agrochemical companies will increase their funding proportionately. which I think is very interesting and deceptive. So I'd like to finish with a quote. I hope I have a little time here. Excuse me, quote, history will judge societies and government and their institutions not by how big they are or how well they serve the rich and the powerful, but by how effectively they respond to the needs of the poor and helpless. And that's our labor leader, Cesar Chavez. And all is not doom. You can see here we have hope on the horizon. I don't know if I have enough time to go through all these, but you can see there has been a plethora of bills passed to support farm workers. The current president of Mexico has banned glyphosate, which I'm thrilled to hear about. We have organizations like La Mesa Verde, and we have an equivalent, I think it's called La Esperanza in Watsonville. So all of these efforts, I think, are moving the food system too slowly for me, but definitely moving it in a new direction. Farm workers who made that journey from Delano up to the Capitol now can vote for unionization without threats from their employers. We've got a bill on farm worker housing. And in 2027, all farm workers, undocumented or otherwise, will get California IDs. We, as an organization, do whatever we can to promote farm worker well-being, including distributions once a month on the second Friday of the month of food, household goods, etc. Here we have farm workers. We chose a place near an alleyway so that those who are undocumented don't feel that they're obvious on a main street. So that's them. And then we also, the most requested item by farm workers are diapers. So there they are. We get them in all sizes, especially size 5 and 6. Okay. And I think, yeah, I think that should do it. We also have computer classes for farm workers where we teach 5 farm workers at a time how to use a computer, Zoom, and the internet. We give them a phone number where they can get free internet. And then the computer they use during the class, they can keep. I do farm worker reality tours to take groups out to meet the farm workers and to hear the stories that I've been hearing over at least 25 years. So these are some of the things that we're doing. I think it's a matter of awareness, getting the public aware, and we need to transform the food system. If we can't do it worldwide, then continue to move in that direction locally. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lopez, for not only giving us that big picture view of international and national policies and how they play out for farm workers, but also for the work that you're doing through the Center for Farm Worker Families to support farmers. And I was actually, we are close to time, but I know that I saw Javier responding as you were talking. And so Javier, if you're still here, I'm wondering if you'd want to come off mute and maybe talk a little bit about the workers on your farm and some of the work that you've done to support them, both by helping people lease land so they can start their own farms. And I know you've also been busy right now trying to support people through the floods.
Absolutely, Lucy. And I was just saying, I mean, it doesn't have to be this way. I mean, there are farms like mine, and Phil Foster and Christine and Del Cook, and that are doing things completely different. I mean, I want my workers to make as much as possible. They make from $17.75 to $22 an hour.
Wow, that's
I don't.
Yes.
I have an irrigator making $56,000 per year. I don't want to be the only one that builds wealth. I want everybody to be inclusive. What is happening right now is everyone is losing workers because there aren't any coming from Mexico anymore like it used to. So the ones that we have here, we gotta make sure that they're comfortable, that they make as much as we can pay them. But you, the end consumer, also need to know that you need to pay a little more for our strawberries. We cannot.
We can hear you, Javier. We just lost your
Okay.
camera.
We cannot afford and we cannot sustain a farm if we don't get the revenue to treat everybody in a humane way. We have to think of that. We don't have the insurance policies that the big, larger companies have. We don't have the financials that the large companies have. Therefore, we rely heavily on the end consumer. And that's why we need to make sure you guys understand where your food's coming from and who's growing your food and what is happening. I mean, I lease a house for my farmers that has a jacuzzi. It's very expensive, but I don't want to put him in a hotel room. You know, that sort of thing. My farm workers, my crew members are the core of this small little company that is making a change. Therefore, we need to support those small family farms near our larger cities where the food needs to be eaten, and understand that we got to make sure that the land that we have gets utilized and not being built on. Gracias.
You're welcome. Lucy, you are mute.
Thanks, thanks, Fernando. I was just saying, thank you both so much for sharing your experiences and your perspectives and your work. If we are pretty much at time. So while I guess while we sort of wrap up, Fernando, I'm wondering if we can change screens. I think the final things I would like to remind everyone of are Laura has dropped a link to an evaluation survey in the chat. We would really appreciate it if you could fill it out. It includes space to let us know how we can improve future webinars. We would also love to have you join us at our next webinar in February on Wednesday, February 15th at the same time at 3 p.m. And I see also we've got a poll here. Thank you, Fernando. So this question is asking about how you will politically engage with the food system. I think particularly in Dr. Lopez's talk, we heard a lot about policies, and so we can see that there's a need for policy change and advocacy in our food system work. So please fill out this poll. And if you've got other ideas, we'd love to hear them in the chat. Our next webinar is Wednesday, February 15th. It'll be at 3 p.m., excuse me. And I think with our last speaker, we really got this, global view of the food system. And these next two speakers are going to bring us back to the South Bay. So we'll hear from Cecilia Sue about the history of agriculture in Santa Clara Valley, particularly focused on Asian immigrant farmers here, and both the policies that have affected their ability to farm and own farmland, but also some of the unique contributions that they've made to this region. And then we will also hear from Nicole Montoya, who's done great work on this report called Roots, Race, and Place that explores racially exclusionary housing policies in the Bay Area. I promise it is not dry. It will be so interesting to hear how and where people live have been shaped over time, and then she'll be tying that back to food access as well. So we do hope you can join us. If you've already registered for this series, you don't need to register again. You should already have the link. It will be the same link as today. So with that, Fernando, next slide. I just want to say thank you again to all of you for being here today. We appreciate your interest in the subject, making time for this conversation. I want to say thank you to our speakers again. I feel like I know I learned so much from all three of you. I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. I also want to thank our organizing committee, which is made up of representatives from La Mesa Verde, Vegilution, Valley Verde, the Public Health Department in Santa Clara County, and then at Cooperative Extension. And finally, I want to say thank you to Fernando, who has done a great job managing the controls of this webinar. So we hope to see you next time in February. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.